As you're jumping on, I just encourage you to read the slides that are flowing, and we will start in a couple minutes. Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Courtney Williams, the host of America's Kids Belong's FosterCon webinar series. I'm thankful to work at America's Kids Belong to help inspire and equip others to become foster adoptive parents and to equip and retain the great homes that are already fostering and adopting by hosting events like this. On behalf of America's Kids Belong, I want to welcome you to tonight's Fostering Trauma Awareness. We're thankful for you to be joining us this evening. As a foster mom of going on 17 years and of over 65 children, I know how important this specific topic is. When we first got licensed, we didn't have a lot of training around trauma. It was, something that was brought up, but it was not a whole lot, to be honest. And shortly into our journey, we realized that something was missing and we were kind of drowning. And this is what it was. Really, it was a lot of training around trauma, more understanding, and tips and tools that we could use in our house. So I'm excited for this conversation this evening, and I hope you are too. At America's Kids Belong, it's our mission to dramatically improve the experiences and outcomes for kids in foster care. And this event is part of fulfilling that mission as we help caregivers understand the importance of understanding trauma and the valuable tools that we can use in our homes. Before we dive into the stuff tonight, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, take a moment again to read the slides as they're scrolling. They share a lot of info, great information, and information on our speakers tonight. Also, as part of tonight's discussion, I want you to know that it is recorded. So you can rewatch this if it's something that you're like, oh, I just didn't catch that, or I need to see that again. It is recorded and it will be hosted on our website, fostercon.org. If you look at your Zoom dashboard, you should see at the bottom a little area that says Q&A. We are going to have an actual live Q&A portion at the very end of our webinar tonight. So don't hop off early. You won't want to miss it. Use that Q&A period throughout this entire night. So if you have a question that pops up, we have some people behind the scenes answering some easy to answer questions. And then some of those more pressing questions we will pose to Ryan and Kayla at the end of our discussion and interview with them. And then also lastly, at the end of our webinar tonight, a survey will pop up, and we would be so grateful if you would fill out that survey. We want to make these webinars more and more beneficial for you and more helpful for us to know what went well. If you have any suggestions or things that we could change, we would love to hear it. And lastly, following this webinar tomorrow, likely tomorrow, maybe the next day, you will get a follow-up email. And in that follow-up email, you'll have a link to many great resources, including a link to our brand new podcast, the Foster Friendly Podcast. And also, you won't want to miss, you have the opportunity to get CE credits. So there's a certificate that you can get to turn in for ongoing training hours. So make sure you do that. And I'll share some ideas at the end of this webinar as well of other training hours that you can get through us. And now we are going to introduce the Norths to you. Ryan and Kayla North are a power couple, and I mean that when I say that. In fact, I was privileged to be trained under them as a parent facilitator when they were with Empowered to Connect in this quite a while ago, probably 15 years or so, I think, doing the math. And I still think of these guys often when I think about examples in my home and tools in my home and just their great work that they're doing across our nation. So let's get to know you two a little bit. Can you share with us a little bit more about your family and how you came to work in this area?
He always looks at me.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, how's it going? Yeah, y'all saw a picture flash on the screen earlier of our kids. We were on the beach, I think is the picture that was up there earlier. We tried to get one of those like really cool, everybody jumps up off the ground and like it looks so cute because they're all like levitating. And yeah, after
But hold
like,
on, there's a Courtney tie-in though.
is there?
Yes, because that beach was on the Jersey Shore in New Jersey, and we met you in New Jersey.
Yes, that's right.
Come on,
There you
somebody.
go. Yeah. So we were on the Jersey Shore. There was like a rip tide. We couldn't get in the water. Everybody was disappointed. It was freezing cold. So they're all wearing like mismatched sweatshirts and stuff like that. So, and nobody's feet really got off the ground except our like, at the time, our 15-year-old son, I guess he was 15 at the time. So our family, we have, just to introduce you to our kids and our family, we started fostering, we got licensed 20 years ago as foster parents, and we fostered for 10 years. We had about 30 kids through our home during that time.
Courtney's like, that's nothing.
I know, right? We had yeah, about 30 kids. We adopted 4 of the kids that are in our home. We have 6 forever kids. We have 2 biological kids in the mix. Our oldest is he'll be 22 here in just a few weeks. And then we have 19. She'll be 20 in November. And then we have 2 16-year-olds, a 13-year-old, and a 12-year-old. And then we have an open adoption. So we kind of have 2 bonus kids. Our adopted daughter's biological mom, we kind of think of her as our oldest kid. She was pretty young. And she's also parenting. And so, you know, we spend a fair amount of time with her and her daughter. And so they're kind of just part of our family as well. So anything I missed?
No, I think in the question was like, how did we get here? Was that part of it?
Yeah.
You know, at the time, when so our 19-year-old daughter will be 20 in November. She was our first placement, and then when she was about 18, she was 4 months old when she came home, and then you know had some other kids in the home, and then our now almost 22-year-old son was placed with us 18 months later, about a year and a half
About a
later.
year, yeah, a little over a year later.
And at the time, because what I realized was that we moved from managing a feeding, medication, therapy, and doctor's appointment and sleep schedule to actually having to parent somebody. Because here was this kid who was mobile and
he had words
and words and all the things, right? And so I remember one night, Kayla, there was an incident in the house, and after we kind of you know got everything kind of back to a regulated state, you know, and he was 4, so this is a long time ago now, and I remember coming upstairs because we were going to have tea together. We have hot tea together every night. That's a tradition in our marriage. And we were going to have tea together, and she was not coming downstairs. So when I go look for her, and she said she was crying outside the bedroom, and she said, "I'm not sure I know how to help him." And so she told a friend of hers that story the next day. And then her friend said, well, you should come with us to a tapestry event. And Kayla's like, what's a tapestry? And her friend gave her kind of a weird look. You know, like kind of when your dog doesn't know what you're doing, kind of turns your head like that. She did one of those and said, it's your church's adoption and foster care ministry. So we didn't even know our church had an adoption foster care ministry. And then we got involved with that. And then Empower to Connect was created. And they asked us to be one of the 8 families that piloted it. We met Karen Purvis, you know, back then Karen came to class and got to know her a little bit. And to keep a very long story very short, through a sequence of events, ended up running Tapestry, running ETC, and then left that 7 years ago. And we've been doing our thing since then. And here we are talking to you.
Here we are.
You are. Wow. You guys really are a hot commodity. I know you guys have a very busy life, a busy schedule, and I'd love to know just what does a typical week look like for the North family?
Oh, we could do this week.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's pretty funny because we also homeschool our kids. We have one daughter that's in public school. We have a special needs daughter. So our days start pretty early because we have to, I say pretty early. A lot of people start
Early
at like
for us.
5:30 or 6. We are not morning people. If I could sleep till 9, that would be ideal for me. So some people probably laugh when I say our days start early at 7:30. But we get up and get her on the bus, our special needs daughter on the bus, and then get our other kids up, and we try and have a little quiet time in between
We have
them.
coffee together.
Have coffee
So,
together.
so we have an espresso machine at the house. We grind fresh beans and put it in a temper it, and because we're kind of coffee snobs like that, so we make our coffee shop drinks, and then she's like, I guess it's time. I guess it's time for peace to
to ruin the
evaporate.
peace. Yeah. So we get all the kids up. So because we homeschool and we work from home as well, we have an office, which is where we are at now, but we also work from home. And so just a lot of the day to day, like during the week, a lot of it looks like going back and forth between calls, meetings, coaching appointments, and homeschooling our kids or playing a little bit of the chauffeur role because they all have jobs. Most of them have jobs. And so, but not all of them have driver's licenses yet. So, doing a little bit of that. Because all of our kids are still at home, even our adult children, they're still living at home.
I mean, if I should provide some context to that, so our oldest, he moved out when he was 18 and then came back.
Yeah.
And his way of saying, you know what, the world was not as easy of a place to dwell in as I had so convinced myself was. What he said was, "Can I come back home for my birthday?"
Yeah, that was 3 years ago.
3 years ago, and we said, "Hey, and I bring that up for a couple of reasons, and we'll probably get into that a little bit later. But to say that everything that happened, he knew that when the bottom fell out, where to come for help." And asked if he could come home. And for us, that's always kind of been the goal for us, is that no matter what, the kids will always know that they have a bed and a seat at the table no matter what happened. And so for us, after a real difficult 18 months with him, there was a little, I mean, I can only think of it as the Lord's kindness to show us that if you stay faithful to the task, it might not be good every day, and there might be a season where it's not good at all for a long time. But there is reconciliation at some point in the future. And so for us, we'll get into that later because it's a whole mess. So she does the heavy lifting on the homeschooling, and then I do the heavy lifting on the business side, meaning like trying to working with child placing agencies and churches. And schools and parents and stuff. When it comes to content creation, we kind of split that about 50-50. And Wednesdays, we book 4 hours off to come over here, and we either make videos or audio things. We record the podcast at night because our host has a day job. And I book all of our travel. And so like in the midst of a busy season like we're in now, Kayla will likely be told when she packs her bag, okay, so we're in this city tomorrow. You might want to check the weather. and I like that. That means she trusts me completely to get it done.
Yeah.
Typically, we'll travel on a Thursday night or a Friday morning, and then either come home on a Saturday night or a Sunday. If we're somewhere fun, like in the west coast of Florida, we'll stay an extra night and go and spend some time at the beach and things like that. So we try to do something fun when we travel. And it's easier now because we got older kids, so we don't have to hire people to come stay at the house. The kids just kind of run the thing now.
Yeah. And we like to travel, take our kids with us. So that's the advantages of homeschooling as well, is that we can actually we can take our kids on a business trip with us.
There's always a promise that they're going to do the math on this seat in the but just one of them does. Our 16-year-old daughter is very academically driven, so she'll do schoolwork on the plane.
Yeah.
But the rest of them just magically end up watching things on screens.
Magic how that happens, huh?
Magic. It's
weird.
Magic. Yeah. So we have these kind of blocks, these seasons. We had most of the summer we were with our family, with our kids, and we were working on content creation and things like that. But now we're in a busy travel season. So almost every weekend we're gone traveling until we get to November. And then we'll have a couple more months of kind of family focused. And then starts back up again in January.
Yeah, so we kind of shut it down from the week before Thanksgiving till about the last week of January, yeah. and then the 2J months in the middle. We don't travel, and it's easy to not travel because there's not a lot going on in terms of events or working with churches because everybody's on vacation and stuff. So we get a good 4.5, 5 months of the year where we're not super busy. But I guess the trade-off for that is you kind of have to squish everything into the other 67.
Awesome. Well, thanks for giving us a little look into your guys' lives. And again, you're just very much a hot commodity across the nation. So I can imagine your travel schedule and family schedule is a lot to manage. But it's great that you guys both can lean on each other and do that together.
Yes, it is.
Okay, let's dive into trauma. Before we dive into some very practical tips and questions, let's start at the very root of all of this, which is our brains. Can you give us a little easy to understand explanation of how our brains work and how trauma affects our brains, the brain?
The answer is, can we give an easy, short explanation? The answer is no. So, honestly, if you had set aside 2 hours to answer that question, that would have been reasonable. I mean, I think, and I think that is reasonable, and we will get to it here in just a couple of minutes of an answer. But we were up in Kansas City last year, and I told the crowd, I said, hey, I was thinking about writing a book, basically like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy kind of naming convention to the parents' functional understanding guide of the brain. And like 100 people said, yes, please write that. Because it's a super complicated thing, right? The brain, but it's also we can think of it if you remember just a few things. One of the things we would tell audiences all of the time is that your childhood experiences are more impactful than your adult experiences. The folks at Harvard think that crossover happens somewhere between 28 and 30. And that's always the challenge, because the people we're typically speaking to, Courtney, are of the age where learning and putting new things into practice is harder. They're kind of set in their ways. That's the way we've always done it. That's not how I was raised, right? And you encounter this, the people who say that as well. And so your brain, childhood experiences, positive or negative. So the bad news is that negative experiences are really impactful. The good news is that positive experiences are really impactful. And so your brain's built in a sequence. The primal part of your brain, your reflexes and motor function lives. The limbic part of your brain, where your emotions, memories, and experiences live. And then the cortical part of your brain, where logic, reason, and executive functioning lives. So that's fun to know. What's also fun to know is that you process information in the same sequence that your brain is. So your emotions get an attempt at making sense of what's happening to you long before the smart part of your brain can figure it out, right? And that's God built your brain like that as a survival mechanism. And so what that means is, if a child comes from a traumatic environment, that those filters of their memories, emotions, and experience, everything you say and do has to run through that filtering system. And so if a child comes into the foster care system because an adult harmed them, well, it's really hard for that child to feel safe around adults. And so we get into struggles, particularly with new foster parents, is like, well, I don't understand why their behaviors aren't changing. Well, because they don't feel safe in your home. And the reality is that you're now having to take on somebody else's burden in regard to the child, because you certainly didn't harm the child, but you represent that which did. Right, which is why kids are triggered easily, right? There's a story in the Perry book, What Happened to You, where this kid he's doing great in school, and then in math he's very argumentative, very contradictory, very adversarial relationship. And then Perry gets called in because the teacher leans over him to help him with the problem, and he pushes the teacher. Now, of the list of things we know that are absolutely true is you can't push a teacher and you can't push a law enforcement officer, right? Those are big no-nos. Well, the kid pushes the teacher. Thankfully, wise heads prevail at the school, and they call Perry in instead of suspending the kid. And so, because he is super wise, gets to the bottom of it and discovers that the person who's abusing the child at home wears the same cologne as the teacher. And so the teacher just standing next to him, kids at the desk, teachers over him, which is mostly a threatening posture in any case, and then being triggered by just the smell of the cologne that his abuser wears, he defends himself and pushes the man away. And that's just an example of how your filtering system gets miscalibrated by your traumatic experiences.
I don't have anything to add. He could talk on the brain for hours.
2 hours. I believe I said 2 hours.
Yeah, it really is so complex and so deep, but also so amazing how we do have not the power, but we have the ability to help them change their brain and help them, get to a safe place, or a place where they can feel safe. And just that huge difference. Again, we'll talk about that more, but the difference between feeling safe and being safe,
right?
Just it's a dramatic difference.
Yeah.
Well, when Courtney talking about, and so we just have to recognize the trauma impacts their brain development, right? But also have to understand that there are some developmental realities that are not trauma connected at play as well, right? As an 8-year-old has limited to no ability to control their impulses, limited to no ability to control their emotional responses. And so what we have is when we have an 8-year-old that's born to a family that's raised by that family, no adversity in his childhood, and he is impulsive. He's just, oh, boys will be boys. But if a child 8 years of age who is in the foster care system, because now we're filtering our response to the child, we tend to think, oh, that's a trauma response. Well, it's boys will be boys when the kid is being raised by the people he was born to, but it's a trauma response when he's living in a foster home. And I think sometimes I know that we have to understand that there are typical developmental issues at play that may have been hijacked by the kid's traumatic experiences, and the 8-year-old's acting like a 4-year-old instead of like an 8-year-old, and all of those things to consider. But we can never lose sight of the fact that is still a human being that's developing and growing, because I think we do a great disservice to the child when we dismiss all of his behaviors as a trauma response, because it might be a developmentally appropriate thing.
Yeah, that is a great reminder. It's easy. I feel like I'm always in that questioning mode, as a foster or adoptive mom. It's like, is that trauma? Is it not trauma? And it is sometimes something hard to differentiate and to know, but it's a great thing to remember that it could be trauma. It's not always trauma, right? And the best thing to do is to get to know the child, right? When we get to know the child and what their responses are, we often know them best and can understand then in those moments whether it is a trauma response or a developmental response.
Well, I mean, we tell people that they need to be the world's leading expert in their children. Mm-hmm. And you have to be, right? Because how many kids do you have living in the house?
7.
Well, you didn't realize you were being interviewed tonight. Right. I mean, and so you could tell us, if I had to say, well, who are morning people and who are evening people? Like you could rattle their names off, right? And that's a simple one. But what triggers them? What aggravates it? What helps them calm? You need to remind to get something to drink. Who's taking care of all of the hydration issues, and you don't have to worry about. And so just to that minute level, you need to understand all of your children, because like you said, the better you get to know the kid, the more you'll be able to differentiate between whether that's typical development or trauma, or the typical development's amplified by the trauma. Yeah. And so we're back to being complicated.
Okay, so most of our listeners, the participants tonight, are likely foster parents, adoptive parents, or potential foster parents. Can you share just a little bit about ACEs, what they are, and what are the most common ACEs we see with kids that are entering foster care?
Yeah, so ACEs would be the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, right? It was done back in the late 90s, I think, is when they concluded the study.
I think the ACEs are turning 30 next year.
Yeah, so it's been around for a while. It's not a new thing, but it's definitely newer in the minds of people. Like people are hearing about it more and more, and so it's becoming a little more common knowledge. But there are 10 basic questions for the ACEs that they ask participants, and they cover 10 different areas. See if I can rattle those off. I don't have them written down. Ooh. So I have abuse, neglect, and
household dysfunction.
Household dysfunction. But they're in these different categories, right? 10 different categories. So it's go ahead.
So it's divided into three categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Under abuse, we have physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. And so typically when we think of foster care, we think of physical abuse.
Or sexual abuse.
Or sexual abuse, but more often than not, we think of just physical abuse, right?
Yeah.
And then neglect, emotional neglect, and physical neglect. Physical neglect, again, that's the thing you hear about. Those are the kids who, are locked in dog kennels, locked in closets, aren't fed, the stuff that makes the news. And then the household dysfunction, you have mental illness, substance abuse, incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, and divorce.
There you go.
So there's only 10 adverse experiences in your life, but those are the 10 that they use in the study, and it's ongoing. I think there's been tens of thousands of data points in it now.
Yeah. And typically, when you see kids who have experienced the household dysfunction, there's some of the abuse and neglect that begins to happen. Not always, right? Not every kid who comes from a family that there's divorce is there, abuse and neglect happening. But a lot of times when we start to see, especially like substance abuse or the domestic violence side of things, or the incarceration, we start to see the abuse and neglect piece of it. So I think everybody always thinks of abuse and neglect as, okay, kids in foster care, there's abuse and neglect. But we also have to recognize there are kids that are, not in foster care that are being abused and neglected. The emotional side of things, the emotional neglect and the emotional abuse doesn't typically land kids into foster care. But we see that a lot is happening. So a child may come into foster care for one reason, but then you recognize that there are a lot of other things that are at play when it comes to those ACEs. So there's, you may be like, well, they were removed for physical abuse, but then all of a sudden you realize that actually they were being sexually abused as well and emotionally abused as well. And you start to run it and you recognize that a lot of kids that end up in the foster care system, they've got a lot of those ACEs that are at play in their life. So, yeah.
I mean, you talk about it in terms of like comorbidities, which I think is the term, because it's unlikely that somebody is in a physically abusive environment where they're being spoken kindly to. Yeah. So the abuse, the physical abuse and the emotional abuse are always kind of, so that's two right there. Sexual abuse, highly underreported for a myriad of very complicated reasons. So you don't have an accurate assessment of who, like it's hard to know, right? The neglect, physical neglect and emotional neglect, again, probably comorbidities. Like if you're not feeding the child, it's likely that you're telling them how much you value the child. And so I'd say the abuse and neglect, and then substance abuse, that's a big player, at least here in Texas where we live. That's a big player, and incarcerated relative is a big player as well. That's how they do that, incarcerated relative. But you could argue that anytime there's an absentee adult, it has a similar impact on the child. Substance abuse, incarcerated relative. Those are two of the big players from the household dysfunction. So I would say that's probably my top 4 or 5 there.
And then in response to that, what are some behaviors we typically see because of these ACEs? I've read a study that the average kid coming in care has 4 to 5 of these ACEs, and oftentimes more. But, so imagine this, it piles up, right? It's like these compiled things that are going on. So in response, what type of behaviors do we see because of these things in kids that are, say, 2 versus 5 versus 10 and 15?
Well, I know you're going to answer that, but if I can just say something about that 4 or 5. So when you look at the data, once you hit 4 ACEs, that's a significant data point in the study, because a lot of people have zero. I don't know how people have zero, but people claim to have zero, and they may have zero. It may be a lack of awareness, right? But once you hit four, now that from a data perspective, that's statistically significant, because your negative outcomes tend to spike exponentially at four or more ACEs, and so that's actually significant. If the kids are coming into care have 4 or 5 ACEs, I don't know if you've heard this, Courtney, but the group that has the highest rate of PTSD diagnosis is combat veterans. Number 2 is kids in the foster care system.
Mm. Yeah. And the behaviors you see, they range from anything. I remember, we were fostering a little girl who was about 20 months old when she came to us. So she turned 2 while she was in our care. And I remember one time I was just talking to a friend, and I was just like, I'm really exhausted because she has been having tantrums all day long. And she's like, oh yeah, mine does too. And I just was like, no. Maybe I didn't explain this properly. When I say tantrums, I'm talking 45 minutes of raging, and self-harm, and if I get close enough, trying to harm me too, and yes, I understand she's, not quite 2 yet, but it was some pretty big stuff. So you can see some pretty big stuff. We've had others that were just, those little, because typically we fostered the 6 and under was kind of our age range, but we did have some older kids in our home, and saw some other different behaviors from those kiddos. And then obviously we adopted kids that were younger, but they got older. They're all teenagers and young adults now. So, and so I think, as a result of those ACEs, we see just bigger behaviors than your average kids. We see, the frequency, intensity, and duration of the behaviors is so much bigger, with these kiddos that we've had that have experienced big traumas, that have experienced just the loss of relationship, not necessarily the ACEs that we're talking about, but even just when we're talking about just loss of relationship, with biological family or friends or teachers or whoever, when they were removed from the situation. We just see that their behaviors are amplified. So you're getting, the toddler tantrums, but they might be, toddler tantrums happening in a 10-year-old. You might have, older kids. I've seen a lot in families that, we've worked with, struggling with substance abuse early on, because they're trying to find this coping, something to help them cope with the pain and the hurt. We see a lot of sexualized behavior and sexually acting out from a lot of kids, that have been exposed to things. Maybe they weren't sexually abused, but they weren't sexually abused in what we would think about in that sense, but they were exposed to things early on. And so you see a lot of sexualized behaviors happening earlier than you might expect them to. So lots of big behaviors.
Well, when I first became a dad, the guy I worked for, who was a great mentor to me for many years, he said to me, he gave me 2 pieces of parenting advice. One was an attempt at humor, so I will not share that here. But the other one, he said to me, your goal as a father is to protect your children's innocence for as long as possible. It's a very evil world out there, and your job is to protect their innocence as long as possible. Well, now the reality for the kids who've come into care is that's been violated at a very young age, right? It's not just that, oh, bad stuff happened, let's see if we can help. I think we have to understand it on the level that some of their childhood is gone and it's not coming back, which is sad if you think about that, right? If you live to be 80%, if you live to be 80, you're only going to spend 25% of your life as a child. Because I just made childhood end at 20 because the math was easier for me. But you know what I mean? But what happens if your childhood just goes off track at 6? Well, it's a hard life, and so I think that we need to talk about those kinds of things with people, because when we see the behaviors at 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever we're talking about, that if you don't remember that this child has had their childhood disrupted. There's a book called Childhood Disrupted, if you've not read it, right? And if you don't think of it in those terms, and you're not going to have the empathy and the compassion that the child needs. So,
yeah. Okay, so continuing this thought around trauma, loss, ACEs, all of it, what are some common misconceptions you see foster and adoptive parents believe about the trauma and loss?
There's a lot of them. I think we had a lot of them.
Yeah.
Going in naively thinking we were going to go in and just kind of rescue kids out of the foster care system, and that we had love and we had an extra bedroom, so why not? And but I think that probably the one that comes to mind the most is just this idea that there's a time frame for healing, that once they've been in your home for X number of days, weeks, months, years, that they will trust you, and that there will be healing, and that everything will be okay. And having been on this journey with some of our kids for nearly 20 years, we realize that there is no time frame for healing. Do we see progress? Absolutely. Have we seen improvements and things going better in certain areas? Yes, absolutely. But then new things crop up and we're like, oh, well, that's different. Oh, well, now we're dealing with this season of hard. And so I think if you go into it thinking like, oh, well, as long as I wait for 6 months. We had somebody in training one time and they were like, if your kid's lying to you when they first arrive in your home, that's okay. But after 6 months, if they're still lying, well, then you just have a lying kid. You just have a liar on your hands. And we were like, 6 months. So that's the time frame for lying to stop. Because we haven't found that to be true.
Can I provide context? This was a trainer who was employed by an agency to train foster parents.
Yeah. Yeah, it was.
Right. I mean, it wasn't just like somebody brought it up in conversation. The other thing that I would add is because I think the time frame is a really important one, because I think we all come to it with the best of intentions. Because, and again, from our personal experience, because you always have, and that's just the way your brain's built, right? This isn't critical. It's just let's understand how things work. You always view yourself in the best light. So when you decide to become a foster parent, you realize that you're going to be full of patience. You're going to be full of kindness. Jesus is going to look down on you and he's going to smile extra special when he sees how you're treating the kids. But what happens is reality sets in, and then all of a sudden you move from, oh, our home's going to be a healing environment, to, I don't understand why he's acting that way. He's been home for 6 months.
Yeah.
Another thing I would say is that we've had a lot of parents go, well, they're not in harm's way anymore. Why aren't they acting differently? And there's almost this idea that if I can just change a child's address, I can change their outcomes. But the child brought all of their suitcases with all of their things with them. And so for us to say, well, if we just change the address, that's tough. And we find that more with international adoption than we do with foster care, obviously. And then the other thing that I thought about was a lot of families, particularly dads, and over the years I've done some work with dads, and they tend to double down on structure, thinking if we could just have enough rules and regulations, and if we can just be punitive enough every time they break one of those rules and regulations, we'll end up in a happy place. So yeah, it's kind of our top 3 misconceptions.
Yeah. And you kind of started chatting about it. So let's go there, about trust. So from day one, when a kid enters the home, how can a foster or adoptive parent focus on building that trust? What are some very specific household habits that you found to be helpful for a family that focuses on relationship and focuses on building trust?
Yeah, because trust is key. I mean, when it comes to kids who've experienced trauma, they're not going to trust you naturally. So you're going to have to earn that trust, and you're going to have to just keep showing up and keep your word when you say you're going to do things. One of the really simple ways when our kids were very little, that we learned to do was, we use a lot of Band-Aids at our house, and it's going to sound really silly, but kids will come to you, and I learned this as a teacher. So I was a classroom teacher. I taught 8-year-old third grade for 11 years. And my students would come to me and they would have a cut on their finger. And I say they had a cut on their finger. I couldn't see anything and there was no blood, right? And so my natural response was, you're not bleeding, you're fine, go play, because they're on the playground and they bumped and they fell. And then I started kind of learning a little bit more, and I started realizing, I think what they're asking me is, can I trust you with this little thing? And I was telling them no. I was saying, you're fine, go play. And they were like, okay, can't trust her. And so with my kids, we were like, okay, we came up with a rule in our house that you're not allowed to put a Band-Aid on yourself. You have to ask someone else to put it on you. And we started just using Band-Aids for everything. It was like, you stubbed your toe, would you like a Band-Aid? And we put that Band-Aid on there, and they realized that no matter what it was, if it was big or small, we were going to be there, we were going to show up, and we were going to be attentive to the need, even if it felt like something that was insignificant. I have pictures of Ryan just sitting there with like a needle and thread, and I have this cute picture. It's like the background on my iPad, and I call it the Dr. Dad picture, where he's taken like the stuffed animals and he has set up like an operating room, like a surgical operating room for their stuffed animals. And he is like gloved and masked like he's a surgeon, and he's going to like tend to the needs, because they love their little stuffed animals. When they're little, they're like a person to them. And so even in those little things, when we're tempted to be like, it's just a stuffed animal, it's not that big a deal, like it's important to them. And it's built that trust for them, like, hey, we're going to take it to Dr. Dad and he's going to fix it. And so he will mend those little things, so just finding even the really small things that you can just show up and be available for, has brought so much trust, because my kids know that they can come to us and that we're going to not just dismiss them and say, oh, that's not a big deal, don't worry about it.
And another thing I would say is that your words have to have value and meaning. So if you say you're going to do something, do it. Like if you tell the kids we're going for ice cream, don't decide you don't want to go for ice cream. You already said we're going for ice cream, so you now have to make it work. So we try to do that as best as we can. But also there's a flip side of that, because my dad was a big fan of yelling out, if you do that one more time, I'm gonna. And if you were raised in that house or not, Courtney, but I was. Don't issue those things. Don't do it, because number one, you shouldn't, and number two, if you do it, you're going to think better of it and not follow through. Right? If you don't stop right now, I'm taking your Xbox away from you for a month. Well, we all know that month is going to live longer than your words. So don't say stuff like that. And so we try to have very measured and appropriate responses to our children. And also always, so we learned from Simon Sinek, who, if you don't know who that is, he wrote a bunch of great books, that he has this kind of formula that he uses, not formula, paradigm that he uses, that we've adopted in our house. And he said, if you want people to believe you're an honest person, you always have to tell the truth. But there's a difference between telling the truth and being completely honest. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'm intrigued. And so what he said is, if he had a friend who was in a play, the play was just objectively bad. And then she asked him afterwards, what did you think? And he said, like, now's not the time to tell her I thought it was bad, because she's so excited. So I decided to tell her something that was true. I loved seeing you up there tonight. It made me very happy for you to watch you just do what you're good at. He said, those both things are true. 3 days later, I called her and said, well, now I'm going to be honest with you. It was not good, and here's why. And so we've done that, because sometimes we think that, well, the only way you can tell the truth is to be completely honest. Well, sometimes you have to tell people information
what they can handle.
to meet them at the place that they can handle it. And so we've tried to do that in our home. And as such, our children are become much more receptive to any kind of correction, mentoring, advice. I mean, I love parenting teens. I don't know about you, but because you get to mentor and offer advice instead of don't do that. Start, you know what I mean, like you do with little kids. So we try to we want to raise people who value the truth. And so we've tried to create an environment in our home where the truth is valued. Mm. Even if there's a negative outcome for you potentially, you still have to believe that doing the right thing by telling the truth is always the right thing to do.
And we've also tried to instill in our kids that their voice matters. Mm. And I think that has built a lot of trust along the way too, because they realize that they can tell us the hard things and that we're going to listen to them. And even if we disagree with them or what, if it's something that we're like, wow, that's really tough. I'm going to have to think about that for a minute. They know that we're going to listen to them. If they have an opinion about something, we're going to listen to their voice in it. And we've just taught them over the years how to do that in a respectful way so that it's not like, you're going to do it my way, but you could say, I'd like to hear your way. I'd like to hear what you'd like to do in that. And I think that's gone a long way in building just trust so they know that their voice matters and they can say what they're thinking and they don't have to be like, oh, well, they're not going to listen to me anyways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so those that are listening, I want to encourage you to check out the workshops that the Norths put on. I'm not going to have you guys give away too much of what you guys do in your workshops, but can you share what would you say is the greatest parenting tool for families caring for youth in care?
So we were trying to decide, looked at this question.
We each have one.
And we decided we were going to give you two. We were each going to give you one.
Is that okay?
That's
okay. We'll take it.
Too much. Okay, you go first.
I think the greatest parenting tool that I've learned over all of the years is for parents to make sense of their own stories. Because once you come to terms with who you really are and you understand why you do things the way you do, and sometimes people are reluctant because when they hear me say you need to come to terms with your past, they hear me say I need to blame my mother for all of my issues. No, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you need to understand why you react the way you do, right? Kayla, for years, would always ask, why does that bother me so much? When the kids' behaviors were just really, you can feel your body tense up. And so we moved from reacting to that to asking ourselves, well, why does that bother me? Because now I need to understand why that bothers me. That doesn't mean we're permissive. It means we're doing the work to get emotionally, mentally, and spiritually healthy ourselves. And so that now we can get to the place where we can respond to the children rather than react to their behaviors.
That's so good.
I think on the surface, it's like, wait, a parenting tool is like making sense of my own stuff. But the only person we actually have control over is ourselves. Like the only person we can actually change the way I am doing I can influence my kids and I can influence other people around me, but I can't actually say, it's like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? Anybody who's ever tried to potty train a toddler realizes like you can't make them go pee on the toilet when they want to, like when you want them to, like they're going to do it on their own time in their own way. I can just influence it, right? And I think but I can decide for myself. I can decide how I'm going to respond and how I'm going to react. And so I, 100% agree with that as like the number one thing the parents can do. And then the other thing really is, and it doesn't sound like a parenting tool, but keep the relationship as the focus. Because when we start to get, especially as our kids get older and they get a little sassy and they start, disrespect, that gets under parents' skin like nothing else. Like when kids are disrespectful, parents just like immediately they're like, I'm the parent, you're the kid, just do what I said, and we all either had a parent or knew a parent growing up that was like, do as I say, not as I not as I do, right? And nobody respected them, and nobody, we wanted somebody who was going to be there and was going to um, care about the relationship and care about what's going on, and wonder why this was happening. And so if we keep the relationship as the focus of every situation, we're not going to get into so many of those battles, because it's not going to be I need my child to be compliant. It's going to be questioning and wondering what's going on in the situation, and how can I help my child versus how can I punish my child? How can I get my child going in the direction I want them to go, while still maintaining the relationship in the situation? So that would be mine.
Great tips, great reminders. I mean, for myself, I hear these things. I've heard these things over and over and over, but I still need to hear them all the time and be reminded myself of relationship. Relationship is first all the time.
Absolutely.
But if you want some practical things, we think that choices, compromises, and redos you can navigate 80% of all situations if you'll do those well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In regards to this, connection-based, relationship-based parenting, I hear a lot of people say, like, I can't do that. That's too permissive, or it's not the way that I was parented. What do you say? What's your response to that when people say, I can't parent like this, or it's too permissive?
May I? Because my favorite is that's not the way I was raised. My answer to that has actually changed, Courtney. Now, what I tell people, I used to tell people one version of an answer, and I realized that's likely some personal immaturity that allowed me to say those things. But what I understand today is when parents tell me that's not how I was raised, I look them in the eye, and with all the compassion that I can muster, I remind them that the world that they were raised to live in does not exist anymore. Mm. Right. And so what I mean by that, there's too much research now on some very important things for us to ignore. Right. It's something that I get invited to do increasingly, so much so that Kayla said, you just need to build a course on this, is the developmental impacts of screens on children. Well, there's just a ton of research on that now for us to understand that. And so if you did not go through puberty with a smartphone, or middle school with a smartphone, then that's completely different. That's a different universe for that child. And then for small kids who went through a global pandemic, and think about all the things there, like one day there was grandma, and then you go to the end of the pandemic and grandma had died and you didn't get to see her, you didn't get to go to the funeral, or you didn't get to go to school, or you were stuck with people who were abusing you. And so for those little kids, that's devastating enough. Like, I want to find a university that'll run, like, being able to recognize people's faces is a developmental milestone. Well, what about all the babies who for years only saw this? Right? Like, that has to have some impact on their brain developments. And so you've got a global pandemic, and as devastating as it was to little children, but then you had the kids who had experienced the trauma that comes from going through your childhood with a smartphone, amplified by a global pandemic. And since none of us on this call lived through those things in our formative years, we have to now, with all humility, concede that my childhood is not a relevant data point in how I should treat my children. That's how I answer that.
Yeah. Great point. Yeah.
Well, and I tend to be
nicer.
No, actually, I'm not sure if my answer is nicer.
Oh, let's vote. If you think Kayla's answer is nicer, tell us in the Q&A. If it's not nicer, I'd like to hear that too.
Oftentimes, people come to me for advice, and they're like, I'm struggling with this, or I'm struggling with that. And when I give them the advice, that's when they tell me, oh, I can't do that. That's too permissive. And I'm like, well, how's your way working out for you? Mm-hmm. Like, how's it going? Yeah. Because I've been parenting this way for a long time, and I see the fruit of it. Like, I have the lived experience now. When I first heard it, I was like, I don't know if this is going to work, but I was trying to trust the research. I was trying to trust the people that had gone before me, that had been implementing and seeing this. And so I often just have to say, you've got to trust that there's a lot of people that have been doing this, And I can tell you the benefits. Does it mean it's going to be perfect? No. Does it mean you're never going to have behavior problems? No. Does it mean you're never going to question, like, should I have done it that way or should I have done it this way? I mean, it can tend to, people can tend to swing to the like opposite pendulum of where they were. So like if you were very strict, you can tend to swing all the way to the other side and become permissive. But this connected parenting approach is really in the middle. It's this balance of nurturing care for my kids and boundaries and structure to keep them safe. And so it's not permissive at all. It's very much so, I care about the relationship, but I also care about your safety and I also care about your well-being. And you may not understand that right now as a kid, you know, but that's what I'm doing. And so for parents who are like, no, 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 I can't do this, I'm always just like, how's it working out? Like, I mean, I guess come back and talk to me in a year when you're struggling even more. You know, I almost want to be like, I can't help you if you're not willing to even listen.
That's not nice. You're right. Nicer.
I was like, I don't think it's nicer.
I think I'm going to change my response. She sounds sweeter when she gives the advice.
It's a great one that, like, I go to a foster care support group and we all probably have attended things like that. And it often becomes this gripe session and people will they'll complain and complain and complain. But then when you try to give a suggestion, it's like, oh, I've already tried that, or I tried it once, or, you know, oh, I'm not doing that. That's not my personality, or whatever it might be. There's always an excuse. And it's like, it's reactive parenting versus being proactive and action-based parenting. It's the opposite.
Well, my favorite is I've tried everything.
Yeah.
And so we've heard that enough that now our follow-up question is, tell me exactly what you've tried.
What's everything? What have you tried?
Because everything means something to me.
Well,
I'd love to know.
And I will say that for some parents who are feeling like I can't do this or I have tried everything, they could be experiencing some blocked care. They could be experiencing some like nothing is going to get through to them at that point. And so sometimes I'm a lot nicer and I'm like, I think you need some care for yourself. I think you need some respite. You need someone to watch the kids for an hour every day so you can just do nothing, or, you know, just read a book or do something that you enjoy for just a small amount of time. I find this especially true with like single parents who don't have somebody that they can tag out and be like, hey, you got the kids, you know, can you do dinner tonight? I'm going to go and take a shower because I've been trying to take a shower all day long, you know, or something like that, where we can get away for a few minutes. And so, but yeah.
Can I amend an answer from earlier, Courtney? Do you have time for me to amend an answer?
We'll try.
Okay, so you said parenting tools, and so a lot of times people come to this, and then they get burned out, right? You've seen the statistics and how many people you say we're done after their first placement, right? It's like 70-something% last time I saw. And so what happens is we go all in and we just burn out. But this is what I tell people, and I love this when we get to talk to Christian audiences, that in Mark 4, after a long day of ministry, Jesus is teaching, the crowd gets bigger, he moves from the bank to the boat, and at the end of the day, he says, it's in the Bible, it says, come, let's go to the other side of the lake. And so Jesus gives us this example that you have to go with your people, your support group, somewhere where all of the work isn't. And I think that anybody who says that self-care is selfish needs to read Mark 4, because even Jesus, like, these dudes are overwhelming. Let's go to the other side. And so I think that's a great example. And making sure you're okay, not just historically, like I suggested, but in the moment, in the present is a better way to say that, is equally as valuable, I think.
Yeah.
I get it. I mean, we're now a therapeutic foster home, and we get some really tough kiddos into our home, usually teenagers that have gone through or are currently going through really hard things. And sometimes we do feel like we're just beating our head against the wall. We're trying everything. We feel that way, even though it's not necessarily true. But one of the most encouraging things for us as foster parents is when other people will comment, they'll notice little changes that we don't maybe notice when we're with them every day. And it is encouraging, and it helps us keep going when we see, or somebody else sees, those little things and the changes in these kids, the impact that we're making. Can you guys share some examples of big wins that you've seen either in your home or in a home that you've been coaching?
Yeah. So one example, one of our kiddos came to us and was, would not come to us for comfort for anything. Like anytime he would get hurt, anytime he would get his feelings hurt or get physically hurt, he would run and hide. He would go, he had a bunk bed and he would get on the top bunk of the bed and he'd get under the cover. So even if he had like a gaping wound on his arm or his leg or whatever, it was like he would just run and hide. And so what I was trying to do with him is I would go and find him and I would bring something that I thought would comfort him. And I was very consistent with this of coming to him and comforting over and over and over again. And I remember vividly the day that he actually came and found me. He was hurt and I was outside and he was inside, and he came and found me. I was standing by the mailbox and he said, I got hurt. And he had a little bit of tears in his eyes. And I just remember, like, I just wanted to cry because I thought, we've made progress. Like, here is this kid that would run away and wouldn't come because it's typical for kids to seek their parents for comfort. And here was this kid who didn't want us to comfort him and would just like go and hide. But because we were very consistent with saying, we want to be your comfort, we want to care for you, we want to love you, he came and found me. Now he still wanted to put the band-aid on himself and didn't, like he wanted to take control of that. But it was this little baby step that I remember thinking it was monumental for our relationship. And that's really what I needed, right? I needed him to make that step in the direction of the relationship's important. And here I have people that will comfort me. And here I have people that will care for me. And so what to most people would have been like, okay, the kid came to you because they got hurt, to me was a huge, like, well, I mean, that was a big win.
It's a huge win because his only experience with adults prior to coming to our home was that adults hurt kids.
Yeah.
And so for him to engage an adult willfully, I recognize that you are a source of comfort and care, like you get that, and likely the people listening to us get that too, but not a lot of people. And you may identify with this, like not even like your close family members and friends get why that's such a huge win. Right. And that's why you need the support groups you were talking about, because like you need to be around people who get it.
Yeah.
From a coaching perspective, I would say some of the wins is when the light goes off in the parents' eyes and they realize that A, they're not the only person in the history of ever struggling with this, and B, secondary to that, when they realize that this mountain we can climb this mountain. And because typically when they come to us, not everybody does maintenance on their relationships the way they do maintenance on their cars, right? They usually just come when my car's in park, the transmission's broken. That's kind of the level that people kind of try to engage us.
Okay, we're about to switch into our Q&A time, but so to gear up for that, you guys travel all over the place. You do this, get a lot of questions. Let's go off of what is the most common question you get and how do you answer that question?
So probably the most common is, my kid is doing fill in the blank with whatever behavior. How do I make them stop? It's like they're lying, they're stealing, they're, whatever it is, they won't sleep, they're disrespectful. Yeah. They don't eat food, whatever it is, fill in the blank. I can answer all of them almost the same way, because it's not about fixing the behavior. It's about figuring out what the behavior is all about. Like what is behind it? What is driving this behavior? And when we can get to the bottom of that, we have a problem solving checklist. Probably our most asked, our workshop that we get asked to do the most is our workshop on challenging behaviors. And that is probably number one. People are like, tell me how to fix these things. And maybe they leave disappointed. I don't know. When we just tell them, like, listen, it's not about fixing the behavior. It's about changing your mindset about the behavior and kind of looking at what's driving the behavior. So that's where we start. We start with what's driving the behavior. Can we get to the bottom of that? Because that's going to give you compassion for your child. It's going to give you a deeper level of understanding of why they're doing what they're doing. And then from there, we can begin to make a plan. Like, how are we going to help prevent this behavior from happening? Can't always be prevented. So how are we going to respond to it when it does happen? Because if outside of the emotional moment of whatever's happening, we can already have a pre-planned, this is how I'm going to respond, then in the moment, we don't overreact. We don't say things we don't mean and all of those things. And so, yeah, I think that's probably the number one thing that I get asked.
And I think what we try to help people understand is behavior is not a light switch. You don't turn it off and on, but it's rather a continuum. And sometimes we forget that if we're just making progress, that's a good day. It's why God told the Israelites to stack the 12 rocks everywhere, right? The Ebenezer stones. So when you go by, you can remember what happened over there. And I think we need to do that in parenting and go, okay, well, you know what? My child used to just have rage for half an hour, but only rage for 20 minutes today.
Yeah.
That's a win.
Yeah.
But we don't look at it that way. We think, no, the behavior needs to stop. And so the question always is some version of help me make this stop. And so moving parents to understanding, like, look, what's driving it, make a plan, be proactive, and then use a measured and appropriate response. Because, we give really bad parenting advice. We say things like go big or go home. Well, that's horrible relationship building advice. But a lot of parents parent from that position in our experience. Crush the rebellion. Kayla likes to say, if your view of parenting is you need to crush the rebellion, you probably need to rethink it.
I love that. Okay, so listeners, we are about ready to jump into our Q&A. So if you got a question, make sure you type it in the Q&A right now, or even during that time of Q&A. Before we jump into that, can you guys share how can people find your resources, your workshops, all the great stuff you guys have to offer?
Yeah, so the best way is to go to our website, onebighappyhome.com. So it's like one spelled out ONE, and then bighappyhome.com. And then we also have a podcast, the Empowered Parent Podcast. And that's a great way to just hear more about, it's topical. You can pick a topic that stands out to you. So if you're like, man, I wish she'd gone into like, how do you stop lying? Like what I said earlier, it's like fill in the blank behavior. We have several episodes just about lying and how to handle that particular behavior. So
so if you go onebighappyhome.com, there's a picture of the two of us on stage. You scroll just past that, these little blocks, and so you can click on stuff for parents, stuff for agencies, churches, schools, podcasts, whatever, and that'll get you to the right place. We kind of categorize the things we do.
Awesome. Okay, now we've got some questions from our listeners tonight. The first one says, it's sometimes hard to answer the ACEs questionnaire since we are often unsure as foster or adoptive parents what happened before they got into our care. So one, what do we do or how do we answer that with limited information? And then two, are there studies about ACEs for in utero treatment or trauma?
I would say that when we work with anybody, any population, we have this list. We call it the developmental trauma checklist, and so it basically combines the complex developmental trauma checklist that's in some places, plus then the ACEs, and then we added global pandemic and screens. Now there are studies on in utero trauma that exist out there on the complex developmental trauma checklist. Prenatal exposure to trauma is the first actual risk factor. So there is stuff out there for that that you can find. And I would say that it's safe to assume that if a child was placed in foster care, you can probably safely assume some combination of abuse, neglect, and maybe a couple of the household dysfunctions. Like I said, here in our part of the world, Buckner did a study some years ago, and neglect was a contributing factor in 68% of removals in the States. So that's a pretty safe bet. And so since that's a safe bet, I would do some research on the impacts of neglect both physical and emotional. Because I remember years ago someone said, trauma abuse says I don't like you. Neglect says you don't matter to me, which is infinitely more devastating to a child. So that's what I would just assume those things, and learn as much as we can. Okay, we like to call the umbilical cord the human USB, because it transfers everything, right? So whatever you had for dinner, if you're pregnant, that's what your kid's having for dinner, right? Um, but also if you're stressed, well, there's a flood of cortisol into that baby. If you're using substance, that substance is influencing the baby's development. So it's not like the baby's in a bubble in the uterus and then comes out no problems. All the stress, all the substance, all the food. If you drink a lot of Coca-Cola during your pregnancy, you will raise a child who wants Coke all of the time. We speak from experience on that one. So I think her first words were large Coke, easy ice. That feels like that was her first sentence.
That sounds about right. Yeah, and I don't think it's super important that we know how many ACEs a child has. I don't think it's super important to know the number, as much as it is to recognize that they have experienced these. And even, I think our very first placement, she came to us as a tiny baby. She weighed 5 pounds, and we naively thought, well, she hasn't experienced trauma. So, I mean, she's never been hurt by anybody. She was in the hospital being cared for by very competent people for 4 months before she came to us. So we were like, oh, there's no trauma there. But then when we did realize, the impacts of in utero, and even the early months of being in the hospital and the trauma that being in a hospital, plays a role in all of that too. So I think it's not as important to know which boxes they check, so to speak, but just to recognize that they do. Any kid that's in the foster care system has experienced those, and likely any child who has been adopted has experienced those as well.
Well, I mean, you led with this. This is your first question, understanding how trauma impacts brain development. And so any form of adversity is going to create what we call today some form of neurodivergence in the child. And so you're just going to have to sign up for, I need to be patient. I need to regulate myself. I need to pay close attention, because anything that comes across as kindness, and you talked about this earlier, they use the word permissive parenting. Well, sometimes we confuse kindness with permissive, but I think that sometimes saying no is kind. Example, if you know that your kids are going to a party where there's drugs, you should say no. And they'll be mad. And it's the kindest thing you can do for them. So it's certainly not permissive, but parenting the child in their best interest is kind of how we approach that and counsel other people to approach it, because you won't be permissive if you're parenting the child to in their best interest, but you also won't be harsh either.
Yeah, and you brought it up earlier, but the book, even just the title of Dr. Bruce Perry's book, What Happened to You, just that mindset of just flipping that mindset of questioning that, and not that you specifically asked the kid that, right? But keeping that on the forefront. It's not what's wrong with this child. Why aren't they acting their age? Why what, the list could go on and on. But so what happened to this kiddo? And now what are we going to do about it? What am I going to do? What am I going to bring to the table that's either going to positively affect it or negatively affect it as the caregiver?
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a good thing to remember, Courtney, that what you do is going to have an impact. It's not going to be benign. And so you have to choose to do the things that will have a positive impact, because it will have an impact either way.
Yeah. This next question, I love this question. It says, in trying to build resiliency and grit, we may not have been attentive enough to the tiny things along the way. Is it too late in the late teens? It seems patronizing or babying now. We aren't completely dismissive, but we say things like, yeah, I'm tired too, or yeah, it hurts, but you still have to do the job you committed to.
Yeah. And that is hard, I think, because in the teen years, you do have to help them stick to things, like our son, our 16-year-old son recently got a job, and every day we take him to this job and he says, I hate working. I hate working. And it's nothing except like he just doesn't like to work, like in general, like
It's not entertaining.
It's not entertaining. He wants fun stuff, you know? And so we're like, I get it, buddy. You know, working's not always going to be fun. You know, I think it's just in the way you say it, you can still be compassionate with them without being patronizing, and without saying like, oh, you're right, you should just quit that job, it's not fun, right? We don't want that. And so we can say it in a way that's compassionate. So I don't think it's ever too late.
So I mean, I think it's never too late.
Yeah.
Right. First of all, from a brain development standpoint, until you're about 30, it's easier to make change. So if the kid's under 30, like for me, it's a no-brainer. But I also think that you're work in progress, and we call time on your growth when the doctor calls time in your life. I'll give an example. My grandfather was 75 years old. My grandfather came to know the Lord when he was 75 years old, right? And somebody would say, well, we just got to give up trying to reach him. Well, no, right? No, we go to the end of a thing. And so this week, our 16-year-old daughter asked us to make sure if her alarm didn't wake her, to make sure she was out of bed at a certain time when we put her sister on the bus, because she had a lot of work to do. And so she didn't wake up with her alarm. I went in there and I said, babe, it's time to get up. And then left. 5 minutes later, I'm going downstairs. She's not out of her bedroom. And I go, babe, it's time to get up. And she says, Dad, I'm tired. I didn't sleep well last night. And I said, sweetheart, you're 16 now. And so now daddy has to speak to you like he's trying to develop an adult, not like he's trying to coddle his child. And she goes, okay. And I said, hey, I was up 3 times last night. For some reason, the alarm on mom's phone went off at 4 a.m. Your dog was
not early.
And your dog was barking at 6. I'm tired, but guess what? I still had to get up and get all the things done. We had to get your sister on the bus. Now we're going to start our work day, because that's part of becoming an adult, is sometimes we have to do the things that we don't like to do because they are required of us. Now, I can speak to her like that, Courtney, because of the things you asked earlier. What kind of environment have we created in our home? Because we've built that foundation, I can now speak to her like that. And so the person who asked the question, I would encourage them to make sure that they're building a foundation on which they can shoot it straight with their children, and not just go from whatever they're doing to shooting it straight. There has to be, again, progress, not on off.
Yeah. And I just, it's never too late to start. And I always say, if you're going to make like a drastic change in what you've been doing, like give your kids a heads up, because they're going to be like, what's happening?
What happened to mom and dad?
Someone took our parents. This isn't normal.
New book.
Yeah. And I'm like, I always just say to parents, I'm like, if you're going to do something that's like really drastic, I would just say, hey, I was learning something in this class that I took, or I was talking to someone and I think I want to change some of the things I'm doing. So it may seem a little strange at first, but just bear with me because I'm learning too, because then our kids see like, we're always learning, we're always growing, we're always maturing. And it's not like I have everything figured out because I'm an adult. Because I think when our kids are little, they think we have everything figured out. By the time they get to be teenagers, they realize we actually don't have anything figured out, that we're just trying to figure it out on the fly, you know? And so I'm honest with them, and I'm just like, hey, I'm trying something new. I know I've always reacted in this way, but I'm trying to respond in a nicer way now. And so, you know, just let them know that you're doing it. So that way they can keep you accountable, because they will. They'll be like, I thought you weren't going to yell anymore. And you're like, yeah, I wasn't going to yell anymore. You're right. I wasn't going to yell anymore. Thank you for reminding me, you know, or whatever it is, you know, but yeah, it's definitely never too late.
Okay. So there, as we said earlier, there's a difference between kids coming into our care or already in our care, that and them feeling safe and being safe. And we know our homes are safe, but then how do we help them feel safe? So somebody asks, what are some items that we could have in hand that provide comfort to kids when they first get placed? Speaking more broadly about these comforting practices when there's not that trust built yet.
Yeah, that's good. I think having spaces that you show the kids, like, depending on the ages of them, right? So if you're talking younger kids, I would have like a calming space that maybe has some comfort items, like a soft blanket, A weighted blanket, I think, is great for a lot of kids. They need some extra sensory input. Um, maybe some music or a snack, maybe a place they can go where there's always a snack available. Food tends to be a big one for insecurities. And I remember we had a kiddo that we were fostering, and she was almost 5 when she came to us. And she went to the babysitter because we were both working full time, and she would go to the babysitter in the mornings, and the babysitter fed breakfast to the kids. Like, this is that where she was going, they were going to feed breakfast, and she made yummy breakfast. The other kids, the older kids that were in our home, they were grabbing a quick breakfast before they went to school, and she would notice they were eating, and if I didn't give her something to eat, even though she was having breakfast, she would like have this horrible meltdown, and I didn't even realize at first what it was. So we just started giving her like a little like cereal bar, and we would say, hey, you can have this, take this with you. And then she would carry it to the babysitter's house, where she realized there was good food there, and she never ate it. Like, it was the same one every morning that she would take. But just having food available for kids, that they can have whenever, they can put it in their pocket, they can put it in their bag or whatever, is huge.
I would say make everything a choice, because in the truest meaning of the word, if you're taking a foster placement, then that child is by definition the victim of somebody else's behavior. And oftentimes, not exclusively, but oftentimes those aren't real nurturing environments. And so one of the way that people tend to heal is when they realize they have power. So you just give everything's a choice. Do you want to walk? You want to hop like a bunny? Do you want with little kids? Do you want to brush your teeth, or do you want to put your pajamas on first? And you can make everything a choice. Choice being two equal alternatives, not do as I say or else, which is oftentimes how people do choices. But I would say that because what that communicates is what you want matters to me. Mm. And that's just a simple way you can make it fun. You can be goofy about it. Red cup, blue cup. I mean, just everything can be a choice. And even with older kids, because developmentally they're typically half their age, you can still do things like that. Something simple like, well, we're going to watch a movie tonight. You get a pick. Well, now it's like, oh, my voice matters. I have power. Mm-hmm. And that's really, really comforting and relationship building.
That one's my favorite. That's my go-to all the time. When new kids, old kids, young kids, yep. Everybody likes a choice.
Any age, everybody likes a choice. Spouses.
You're kind enough not to say it, but it was implied.
Yeah. Okay, last question I've got for you is, people listening might feel like, okay, this is new to me, or I've heard this a lot, but I need to know more. What are maybe the top 5 books that you would suggest that people should or must read around the topic of trauma-based parenting?
So we've named a couple of them already just as we've been talking, but we came up with a list of books. So, perfect. So one of my favorites is a book called The Power of Showing Up.
Oh, it's so good.
And I think that one very simply explains attachment and how attachments are formed. It's not a book that's intended for parents. It's not a book that's intended for parents parenting kids who've experienced trauma. It's just a parenting book, but I think they do address trauma in there, and when trauma disrupts some of these things. But I think we don't often think about how attachments are formed, and so I think that's a really good one. And that's Tina Payne Bryson and Dan Siegel. And then on the same authors have another book called The Whole Brain Child, which is a fantastic book just for understanding how the brain works. So if Ryan's, like 5-minute explanation of it was not enough, which it's never enough.
It's never enough.
That one is a great one. And what I love about it is that it's not written from the perspective of like this, like it's very smart people writing it, but they've written it on a level that just like common folk can understand. And you don't feel like they're saying all these words that you're going, I'm going to have to put this aside for a minute because it's a little too much for me, but it feels manageable and easy to read. And like you walk away going, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah,
oh, I understand. So,
and then we mentioned What Happened to You, the Bruce Perry Oprah Winfrey book. We recommend the audio version of that
it's really
because
good.
it's Perry and Oprah having a conversation. And then Bruce Perry, a book called Born for Love. The full title is Born for Love: Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. And that book literally changed the way I thought about people. It was a transformative book in my life. And so I always recommend that. And then we've talked about the ACEs a couple of times already tonight. If you want to understand that a little bit more, there's a book called Childhood Disrupted by the author is Donna Jackson Nakazawa, which when you see the author picture, she's like a 5 foot tall blonde lady from Minneapolis, but married to a man from Japan. So she's Donna Jackson Nakazawa. So if you Google that and you see a tiny woman from Minneapolis, it is the correct author. But Childhood Disrupted, that's a pretty good dive into the ACEs if you want to understand that a little bit better.
Awesome. Thank you. Those either on, do not get off. We've got a couple things to end with. I just need to quickly share my screen and share my slides here. As I'm doing that, I do want to say again, Ryan and Kayla, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time and your busy schedule. You guys are always a pleasure to hear from, and to just, you guys have just a knack with understanding kids from hard places and being able to share it with parents that are caregiving and sometimes say the hard stuff, but always saying the stuff that we need to hear. So thank you again for your guys' time and being here with us tonight.
Absolutely.
It's a very kind outro, Courtney. Thank you.
Also, we are a nonprofit, and so we encourage people, if you enjoyed this content tonight, you can use this QR code or go to americaskidsbelong.org to help fund more great content like this. We want to continue to be a resource to foster families, and it's an easy way for us to be able to provide these things is when we have people support our mission. So americaskidsbelong.org, we would be grateful for that. And also, as I told you at the beginning, there are other ways for you to get more ongoing training credits. This is our next and last live webinar in the FosterCon webinar series of 2024. This one is called Fostering Support, Explaining the Foster-Friendly Communities. This one's not quite, it might be for you if you are a foster parent or adoptive parent who owns a business or is a church leader. This is a great one that you would not want to miss out on. If you're a foster parent that doesn't pertain to you, share this with other people that you know might want to come to this and learn how they can really support you in your fostering journey. But check out fostercon.org. This has been a series. So if you've missed our other webinars, you can still watch the ones that we've already recorded live. They are now on demand, and you can still get credit hours for those. You can still get that certificate of completion if you watch them on demand. So, and also a little sneak peek, we have 3 on demand that will not be live, that will only be on demand, that we're going to be releasing in November. And they are currently being recorded, and they are wonderful. So one is on hearing from former foster youth, one is on cultural components, and the other is engaging biological families. And they are great conversations you won't want to miss. And then we're going to end this evening with a short video from one of our very own, who is a former foster youth, sharing her story and why this matters so much. Well, if it will play. Hold on a second here. Of course, I checked all this out before we got on here, and now I can't get the video to play. Fortunately, I might have to show it to you in a small screen because I don't know why the button isn't coming up to play. But that's okay. Better small than not at all. Actually, it's still not playing. Well, our producer is listening to this, and she will include this video in the email that goes out to you guys. I'm sorry that it's not popping up right now. But this is a great little video, just again, explaining why trauma awareness, why is this such a big topic? And it's a former foster youth sharing a little bit about her journey and why this is something we cannot overlook. I hope you enjoyed this content tonight. I know that you all, like me, enjoyed hearing from Ryan and Kayla. And we just want you to know that you belong, the kids in your care belong, the kids that will be in your care belong, and that is our goal. We want kids and people to know that they belong. So thanks for joining us tonight.